Chapter 2. The Night Watchman's Dilemma. When he awoke and stared out at the walls of the city, Heinrich realized that he had not gained any clarity at all. He wasn't even sure of what he had in the way of concrete evidence. And had he been confident of what he'd found, with whom would he share it? His exposure of some kind of criminal activity was as likely to bring about his own untimely death as anything else. Still, he knew that something was amiss and that he couldn't just sit on his findings, however incomplete they might be. As he thought about it, the only one he really trusted was his wife Irmgard. But how much help could she provide? Like him, Irmgard was unable to read, so she could no more unravel the mystery of the parchment he had purloined than he could. He began to question the wisdom of pilfering the parchment from the stranger's satchel. He even thought about how he might rid himself of this document before it came back to visit trouble upon him. Then, in a flash, he remembered someone else who was worthy of his trust. His friend Ewald, whom he had known from childhood, just might be the perfect person to help unravel this mystery. Not only could Ewald read, for heaven's sake, the man read poetry, but he also had a sharp and piercing intellect, along with an impeccable reputation. On top of that, Ewald had a kind of moral compass that always seemed to point him in the right direction. He was diligent and hard-working, but had not a shred of selfish ambition. As a result, he was the person the town fathers relied upon to solve all kinds of mysteries and difficult or sensitive problems that might threaten the well-being of the town. Heinrich made up his mind to solicit the help of his friend Ewald before the next set of night rounds. Ewald would know if the matter deserved additional pursuit, or if it was some kind of red herring. Heinrich decided he would seek him out before his evening rounds and lay his puzzle before him. He knew better than to ask Ewald to join him on his rounds, for although they would have had plenty of privacy, it wouldn't do Ewald's reputation any good to be seen in the presence of a night watchman in the dark of night. Heinrich knew that at the end of the working day he'd find Ewald at his favorite haunt, der Hase und die Schildkröte, the hare and the tortoise. Ewald was not a big drinker, but he enjoyed visiting the public house to relax and to pick up on the latest gossip about town. Sure enough, when Heinrich entered the tavern, he saw his friend in the middle of the room doing what he did best, listening to the conversations around him. As Heinrich approached him, Ewald looked up in mild surprise. "Not used to seeing you out and about at this time of day, Nighthawk," said the solver of town mysteries. "You're usually asleep until just before dark. What brings you into the light?" "I have a troubling puzzle that I can't figure out," said the night watchman, "and I've got a clue that I can't cipher. At least, I think it's a clue." Then Heinrich told him the tale of the mysterious traveler he'd run across the night before. Ewald didn't interrupt, letting him tell the whole story, including the traveler's private meeting with Schultz, the innkeeper of Gasthaus Greifen. He also mentioned the proprietor's puzzling comments about the parchment pilfered from the stranger's satchel. After Heinrich had said all he had to say, Ewald paused for a moment to think, and then said, "Well, let's have a look at this particular piece of parchment you've procured." Heinrich laughed silently to himself. Only Ewald would utter a phrase like that, showing off his skill with words. The problem solver pored over the words of the parchment for several minutes before speaking again. "By all that's holy," he murmured, "I swear that one day I am going to teach you to read, so that you can figure out these clues on your own." It was a threat that Ewald had made repeatedly, and Heinrich knew he meant the part about teaching him to read, even as he knew the complaint about helping him was in jest. Now his friend's eyes grew serious. "If this is what I think it is," said Ewald, "then you've stumbled onto something significant." He went on to explain that what the document he held in his hand was, and what it meant. Ewald reminded his friend of the special status Rothenburg enjoyed as a free imperial town. There were definitely advantages to that status. The town was allowed to set up many of its own laws and regulations, rather than submit to the regional laws of those around them. But there were also responsibilities that came with that privilege. The town was committed to paying tax upon income generated within its walls. To that end, the town fathers had set pricing for goods bought and sold within their jurisdiction. That made it easier for them to assess taxes that went into the town's coffers and into the purse of the emperor. While it was common knowledge that certain traders would simply sell their goods to the highest bidder, the majority obeyed the rules. No trader, after all, wanted to fall afoul of the town fathers, lest they lose their trading rights and the protection that the walled town provided. That's why there was always official paperwork that bore the seal of the town's bookkeeper, testifying to the validity of the quantities and prices of things sold in the town. Even in the Middle Ages, Germans loved their paperwork and their stamps and their seals. These seals were extremely valuable and closely guarded. Only those with authority possessed them. Without the seal, one couldn't make any money in Rothenburg. Ewald pointed to the seal on the parchment his friend had presented him. It was indeed the seal of the free imperial town of Rothenburg, or so it seemed. The red stone walls, some of which had been taken from the red castle that had once stood on the premises, and from which the town had taken its name, were obvious. So were the twin towers of the Jakobuskirche, the massive church that dominated the skyline of the town. And that's when Heinrich's eye caught it. It was something that every citizen in Rothenburg now knew, thanks to the investigative work of his friend Ewald. In solving the mystery of the death of the master builder of the Jakobuskirche, Ewald had discovered that the twin towers of the church were, in fact, not identical. The apprentice's tower was actually several meters higher than that of the master builder. The city leaders already knew of this, but had kept the matter secret. Still, the official seal of the town clearly, though discreetly, showed the differing heights of the towers, something that had escaped the notice of all but the most diligent observers. Heinrich, as a person used to careful observation, had also noticed the differing heights of the towers long before his friend Ewald had stumbled upon this fact. It was, after all, Heinrich's job to look over the town nightly. Sometimes he did that from the high walls opposite the church, where the difference in tower heights was obvious to those who looked carefully, even at night. When Ewald saw that his friend had discerned the truth about the seal, he asked him, "So, friend, do you know what this means?" When Heinrich simply stared at him, Ewald replied, "It means this parchment, this bill of sale, is a forgery." It wasn't issued by the town bookkeeper. It was created by someone else to hide the true amount of the sale. Someone is selling goods for more, but only claiming a fraction of the price, thereby cutting out both the town and the emperor from their lawful, if not rightful, share. The question of what to do with the information he possessed still troubled Heinrich. He really had no authority to apprehend anyone. He certainly didn't have the kind of standing in the community to rally support for an investigation. Besides, as his friend Ewald pointed out, how was he to know who else might be involved in the plot? Were the innkeeper and the traveler operating alone, or were there other townspeople making money off the scheme? Heinrich went home to think about it and perhaps to sleep a bit before his next set of rounds at dark. He was relatively certain that the stranger wouldn't leave the inn until after the sun had gone down. He'd never observed it personally, but he assumed that someone could exit the manhole at night. Whether or not they had to pay to get out, he couldn't say. Despite his anxious thoughts, Heinrich managed to get some sleep. He woke up a bit earlier than usual and washed up before donning his night watchman garb. He was too anxious to eat, despite protestations from Irmgard. Not wanting to worry her, he hadn't told her anything about what he and Ewald had discovered. As the daylight faded, he walked out the door, telling Irmgard he was leaving a bit early to talk to the innkeeper. She would assume it had something to do with his second job and wouldn't think anything of it. As he approached the inn, he still hadn't formulated any kind of plan. What would he do when he reached the inn? Would he confront Schultz? He'd surely lose his day job if he did. But how could he let these people get away with something that cheated not only the emperor, but the rest of the town? When he arrived at the inn, he paused for a moment before opening the door. At that moment, the door opened and out stepped the stranger named Stoyaman, dressed for travel with his satchel across his shoulder. The two men stared at each other without speaking, neither moving. "Step aside," said the traveler, with the authority of someone who was used to getting what he wanted. When Heinrich didn't move, the man continued, "Just who do you think you are?" "I know exactly who I am," replied Heinrich. "I'm the Night Watchman, and my job is to watch, and that includes watching you. I've not seen you on the streets in daylight before. From where do you come, and what brings you to Rothenburg?" "My business and my home life are my own concern and none of yours," retorted the stranger with a voice that was just below a snarl as he started to take a step forward. He froze when Heinrich didn't flinch. There is something about a large man in a black cloak holding a weapon that looks like it was forged in the fires of hell that gives one pause. "Maybe you'd care to explain this," countered Heinrich as he drew the parchment with the fake seal from inside his cloak and held it out for the man to see. "How did you come by that?" demanded the stranger. "Are you nothing but a common thief who goes through the possessions of a man of business and takes what he wishes?" "When your business affects the well-being of my town," replied the unflinching watchman, "then it becomes my business as well. Watch your step, traveler, or you'll travel no farther." Heinrich could see the shift in the man's eyes as he pondered the turn of events. Suddenly, his voice dropped lower and became more conciliatory. "Let us retire into the inn," suggested the stranger. "Perhaps we can come to a mutually beneficial arrangement. He then motioned toward the still open door and took half a step. Still not sure what his plan was, Heinrich gave a curt nod and moved toward the entrance. The two quickly found a table in the corner where they could converse unheard and undisturbed. The innkeeper's wife, Frigga, brought them each a tankard of ale and left quickly after seeing the men's expressions. She knew both men and had been around this kind of discussion before. More accurately, she knew when to step away and stay away from discussions like this one. Fixing Heinrich with a hard stare, Steuermann spoke first. "So you've got something there that you think I want," he queried. "And just what do you think it's worth? And what do you plan to do about it?" It was one of those occasions when time seemed to stand still for Heinrich. For years, he hadn't been content to spend his whole life as a despised and denigrated night watchman. He had dreams and aspirations that far exceeded his current situation and status. While he wasn't given to delusions of grandeur or visions of life without pain or limits, he did want an existence that allowed him to provide for his family and escape the daily drudgery of making rounds and then cleaning up after others in the tavern. What was this piece of parchment, or rather the information it contained, really worth? Would it be enough for him to get out of a life of near poverty? Would it allow Irmgard to stop taking in laundry? Would they finally be able to have the child they talked about so often? Heinrich knew that he was no shrewd negotiator, and he also knew that he didn't have a clue how to ensure that this Steuermann would keep his end of the bargain, whatever that might be. There was something else, however, that troubled him. His job was to protect the citizens against harmful influences, not to profit from those influences. The townspeople had paid the full price for the goods they'd purchased, including the taxes that were intended to keep the town safe and in good repair. But the money that should have gone to their benefit was being siphoned off by the stranger sitting in front of him and by his partner, the innkeeper. Heinrich knew that this devil's deal was simply wrong. One other thing bothered him. Just how dangerous was this man? To what lengths would he go to protect his investment? Would Heinrich spend the rest of his days looking over his shoulder? All those thoughts passed through his mind in a flash, but he was still uncertain how to proceed. In an attempt to buy more time, he returned the stranger's stare and replied, "And how much is my silence worth to you, Herr Steuermann?" The stranger's eyebrow arched upon hearing his own name. Then his eyes darted to the parchment and then quickly around the room. "I'm not even sure that what's written in there is worth anything," he replied. "I really need to take a closer look at what you think you've got there." And with that, the stranger calmly reached for the parchment. Then he sprang from the table with the parchment in his hand and headed straight for the fireplace to burn the evidence against him. Reflexively, Heinrich grabbed the Hellebrand at his side and used the hook to trip the fleeing stranger. Steuermann scrabbled on his hands and knees toward the hearth and raised his hand to cast the document into the flames. With a quickness that the eye could barely follow, Heinrich threw his Hellebrand, piercing the parchment and pinning it to one of the wooden beams near the fireplace. He then fell on the stranger, subdued him, and tied him hand and foot. Exactly the kind of thing he'd been trained to do. At that moment, Irmgard unexpectedly came through the door, looking for Heinrich. She screamed when she saw him on the floor, before realizing that he was unhurt and had subdued and secured Steuermann, who was scowling and spitting. Heinrich told her to quickly fetch Ewald and a couple of constables, so they could transport the stranger to a holding cell. He then retrieved his Hellebrand from the wooden post, removed the parchment, folded it, and put it in the pocket of his cloak. As Irmgard fled to find Ewald, Schultz, the innkeeper, entered the room and froze as he saw Heinrich with Steuermann in ropes on the floor. Before he could turn to run, Heinrich had the business end of his Hellebrand pointed at the innkeeper's throat. "Surely you're not in such a hurry to leave your own establishment, Herr Schultz," said the night watchman with a grim smile. "Why don't you sit yourself down and enjoy the ambiance of your Gasthaus for a moment? I'm sure our friend Ewald and the constables would like to have a little talk with you as well as with your acquaintance, Herr Steuermann." The constables arrived shortly thereafter and quickly, though not gently, marched both Steuermann and Schultz to the lockup. Justice moved swiftly in towns of the Middle Ages, and Rothenburg was no exception. A day after their apprehension, Schultz and Steuermann appeared before the magistrate to be tried for their crime. Soliciting a confession hadn't taken long. Having the falsified document as evidence certainly helped, but the threat of torture while in jail was also a strong motivating factor. Because Rothenburg was an imperial city, the crime committed was also perpetrated against the emperor. That meant that the two men would be sent to face those charges in the imperial court. But before their departure, the two were pilloried outside the courthouse in the center of town. While there were much more severe punishments than being pilloried, being exposed to public humiliation was nothing anyone wanted to experience. The two men were stripped and locked in an open cage. Even their hands were chained so that they could not protect themselves from the rotten fruit, vegetables, and other dreck that was thrown at them. There were no bathroom breaks either. After a day of degradation and humiliation, the two misfits were sent off in chains to face an additional trial and further punishment under the watchful eye of the emperor. It was generally assumed that the two were hanged for their offenses. At any rate, their faces were never seen in Rothenburg again. Even though Schultz's wife, Frege, was not charged with any crime and had known nothing of her husband's misdeeds, she was still the wife of a criminal. Part of her husband's punishment had been the forfeiting of his Gasthaus. With no means of support and no reputation to salvage, Frege quickly loaded up a wagon with what possessions would fit and left town to live with family in Würzburg. Heinrich was briefly feted by the townsfolk for his role in apprehending the scoundrels. For a night or two, he was unable to buy himself a tankard of ale anywhere in the city. Everyone wanted to thank him and acknowledge what he'd done. He had more to drink in those 2 nights than he'd had in a whole month before. But that quickly came to an end as life returned to normal, and he prepared himself for a return to his daily drudgery. Having lost his day job cleaning at the inn, Heinrich wondered where he would find work to supplement his meager night watchman's pay. Fortunately, he didn't have to wonder long. Even though they had confiscated the innkeeper's property, None of the town fathers had any desire to actually operate the inn. Such a task simply wasn't fitting for men of their stature. So they came up with an ingenious solution. While the property would remain the possession of the town, they hired Heinrich and Irmgard to run the place. Heinrich and Irmgard would retain 10% of the profits. The city would receive 90%, of which, naturally, the city leaders would each carve off a slice. And it was understood that the city fathers would never be required to pay for ale or food whenever they deigned to appear at the inn. While Heinrich's 10% was meager compared to the amount that went to the town and the leadership, it was still more than double what he and Irmgard had been earning before. That meant Irmgard could afford a new dress now and then, and that Heinrich didn't have to walk around in worn-out boots. And it meant they could pursue their dream of having a family. And while being an innkeeper wasn't a position of great respect, it was a far cry from the disdain that had been heaped on Heinrich before. Because it was a new beginning, everyone agreed that the inn's former name, Gasthaus Greifen, was no longer suitable. After a very short time, Heinrich, in his typically practical manner, announced that the inn's new name would be, what else? Haus der Nachtwächter, the Night Watchman's house.